What do you think makes a game a survival horror? The horror part is pretty self-explanatory, just give the player something to be afraid of, but the survival part is a little more complex. I consider it a mixture of multiple elements like disempowerment, mental challenges alongside the physical ones, and constant obstacles that force the player to carefully consider every decision they make. What I think makes a game a survival horror is best exemplified by the masterpiece that coined the genre's name, Resident Evil. And with such masterpieces, you're inevitably gonna get a few clones, many of which I've always wanted to get around to, and today we're gonna tackle one of those games. A game that was admittedly sad to be made in the vein of Resident Evil. I'm talking about the 1998 Sega Saturn game, Deep Fear. The game was co-developed by 4 different companies: former game developers System Sacom, Sega's internal development division CS2, another defunct company named Highway Star who worked on the CG graphics, and ISCO who made the FMV cutscenes. You know, 98 is pretty far into the Saturn's lifespan. Deep Fear would be one of the final first-party titles released for the console. It's the same year the Dreamcast debuted, and it's probably because of that this game never saw an official North American release. If you lived in North America and wanted to play this game in full English, you'd have had to import it from Europe. What's funny is, years after Deep Fear's release, it was discovered and leaked online that there was a finished version of Deep Fear for NTSCU, completely playable and in full 60 FPS. It just never saw a release. The game had a pretty mixed reception from what I can tell, but it's always more fun to play the game yourself and form your own opinions, and that's exactly what I plan on doing. So without any more stalling, let's just see what this game is all about. The story takes place in an underwater research base known as the Big Table. We control Emergency Rescue Crew Chief John Mayer, who's tasked with doing exactly what his job implies: rescuing anyone who's in trouble from danger. But alongside John there's Mookie, another member of the ERS and John's subordinate. There's Danny, Dubois, Sharon, and Anna, workers with various jobs in the Big Table. Clancy, the Big Table's commander, a biologist named Gina, and a SEAL team coincidentally led by John's former commander, Colonel McCoy Lambert. The game itself opens with the scene of a space pod falling from orbit and landing in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. A few moments later, a nuclear-powered US submarine dubbed Sea Fox retrieves the capsule. Then we cut to the inside of the Big Table. We see John Mayer looking at a picture of a woman named Stella, but he's interrupted by Mookie, who tells him there's an emergency. Sharon is drowning. So John rushes his way to where Mookie and Sharon are, and alright, before I go any further, I just gotta point out the voice acting. It sticks out like a sore thumb, and I'd be remiss not to mention it. It's just awful.
Wait, what have we here? A torch. With this, I can torch the airlock door. Can I borrow this?
Like, I know this came out at a time when voice acting was still relatively new for video games, and the original Resident Evil games didn't have stellar voice acting either, but the performances in Deep Fear are a special kind of bad. You have lines that aren't delivered with the right attitude or intensity, which, okay, I can blame on whoever directed the voice acting. But then you have characters who stumble over their words or start mumbling at the end of their sentences.
If you don't change, we may have a lead.
What did he want?
Your company is fine too, but you have to get out of here alive first.
I had to do multiple listens of my own footage just to make sure I was hearing the right thing. And I have to believe they were taking the piss and being intentionally offensive with Dubois, who I'm pretty sure is supposed to be French.
And if all that air leaks into the ocean, the air will expand and cause a blowout phenomenon above water. We've got to tell Clancy and make him stop. Oh, there's no problem with my CFOX system. No accident should have occurred. Oh!
This game goes into the terrible voice acting Hall of Fame. Don't get me wrong, it's funny as hell and I love it, but it probably would have been for the best if this game was entirely voiced in Japanese with English subtitles or something. But anyways, back in the story, it turns out Mookie and Sharon just pranked John to lighten the mood around the Big Table, because as Mookie claims, it's gotten too stuffy around here. By the way, it's worth noting John has a cough. But after that, John is called to the Big Table's command deck for a real emergency concerning Sea Fox. It somehow escaped from where it was docked and crashed into part of the Big Table's Navy area before landing on the seafloor. In the command deck, Clancy gives John permission to go to the top secret Navy area so he can rescue Gina. Then he and Mookie disembark from the Big Table in their own little submersible called Little Shark to make their way there. Once you're in the Navy area, Mookie runs off looking for top secret Navy weapons, but he doesn't make it far before we get our first real bit of horror. You see a bloody, bruised, and tattered man begging for you to kill him, going so far as to give you his gun, but of course John refuses. Then the man transforms into this gross monster with a bulging purple arm and what looks like 5 insect legs for fingers and a spike protruding from the side of his head. It's such a weird design, but I like it a lot. Mookie runs off scared, but we put that guy down easily with that gun he handed us before he turned. Dedicated to the mission though, we push on through the Navy area and eventually find Gina along with a chimpanzee she seems to really care for named Anthony. After rescuing Gina and making his way back to the big table, John accosts Clancy about the monsters in the Navy area, but Clancy, being the military man that he is, tells John that it's top secret and none of his business. Then the situation goes from bad to worse when it turns out that someone inside the Sea Fox has launched a torpedo at the big table. And once the Sea Fox starts preparing to fire nuclear missiles, Clancy sends John and Mookie on another mission to enter the Sea Fox and stop the launch. In the Sea Fox, John meets a man in distress who claims everyone else is dead, and John tells him to wait in the Little Shark with Mookie while he disables the missiles, which John eventually does. It turns out everyone on board the Sea Fox was infected with whatever makes them turn into monsters, and the Sea Fox's second in command went crazy or whatever and started launching the missiles, but thankfully he died before he could finish. Anyways, when John and Mookie make their way back to the big table, that man they rescued in the Little Shark turns into a monster as well. John was outside of the sub before the guy turned, but our less fortunate friend Mookie is killed in the Little Shark and dies on the controls, which lowers our only means of escape into the ocean. The monster somehow survived though and boards the big table, exposing everyone on board the base to the parasite. That's basically the game's introduction. From there, the situation continues to get worse, and John is pretty much tasked with rallying all the survivors and finding a means of escape. Is it just me, or does anyone else really love the big table as a backdrop for a horror game? Being surrounded on all fronts by water gives you the perfect sense of isolation that you would want from one. It takes inspiration from the 1989 science fiction movie The Abyss in both design and narrative. For anyone who's unfamiliar, the film is about an underwater oil rig crew and SEAL team who have been tasked with rescuing the survivors of a downed submarine. Unfortunately though, I don't think Deep Fear does a good enough job of taking advantage of this setting. The big table never feels as claustrophobic or as frightening as it should. Yeah, you're forced to run down these dark tight corridors with nothing but the sounds of the big table and your own footsteps accompanying you, but that's about all the game does to try and scare you, or build any atmosphere. The fact this game uses fixed camera angles really upset me too. Not because they're bad or I dislike them or anything, but they're not properly utilized to build any tension at all. Do you know why they're so effective in horror games? It's because the developers have complete control over everything the player is forced to see. If they want to flesh the world out, they can use fixed camera angles to draw your eye to certain objects, or indirectly tell you a story. But if they want to frighten you just as well, they can make it seem as though you're being watched, or they can fill you with anticipation and dread of whatever may be around a corner. Every frame is like a carefully directed scene, or at least they should be. Deep Fear rarely does anything interesting with the scenery of the big table, and that's a gigantic waste of potential in my opinion. I would have appreciated something like, I don't know, a wide shot of the big table that could have hammered in just how remote we are. But the most this game does to build any atmosphere at all is put you in a room where you can hear the sound of enemies moaning, but don't know where they are just yet. It's effective, but that's as ambitious as this game gets with its camera angles. There's never a shot that makes you scared to move on to the next screen. There's only 2 shots I felt I had to stop and appreciate. This one where an unexploded torpedo had crashed into the big table, and this one where enemies come in from off screen and run down a hallway towards you. Those are the only 2 shots in the game where I wanted to stop and smell the roses, you know? You want to know how Deep Fear tries and fails to scare you most often? They'll just drop an enemy on you from the top of the screen. At least they get decent mileage out of this setting gameplay wise. Oxygen is gonna be your most important resource here with this game taking place underwater. In the top right corner, there's a number that indicates how much air is left in a room or corridor. Run out and your air meter starts draining. You can manage this by replenishing air at these terminals that double as a save point. You also have a breathing mask called a regulator that lowers the speed which your oxygen depletes. This works for rooms with a lack of oxygen just as well as it works for rooms that are flooded. And this also needs to be refilled at air terminals. I like the idea of the oxygen system a lot. It could have added an urgency to everything you're doing to make the game feel more stressful, but truthfully, I never came close to running out of oxygen. There's air terminals everywhere, and actually, this is already going into what I think is the game's biggest flaw. I rarely came close to running out of any resources ever. See, there's 3 things you're gonna have to stay on top of: health, ammo, and oxygen. I've already said how easy it is to regain your oxygen, but it's even easier to get your health back. You'll find these medkits that have an infinite supply of first aids, and they heal you for a good bit too. You're able to stock up to 8 of them at any time, and you can find plenty of other healing items hidden in the big table. To be fair, it's not often you'll come across these medkits, but if you know what you're doing, you won't be struggling to keep healing items in supply at all. Ammo is an even bigger joke. In these storage lockers where you can find new weapons, you can just as easily stock up on all the ammo you need with the press of one button. What's weird is you actually do find ammo scattered on the ground or hidden in cabinets, but it's not ammo you can reload into the gun. They're ammo capacity upgrades. And these things aren't scarce either. You'll find tons of them in this map. I can only recall one time I was actually afraid of running out of resources. That was at the very beginning of the game when the oxygen mechanic was introduced and I wasn't acquainted with the map yet. I was really disappointed with how much they hand everything to you on a silver platter in this game. And you know what you get by extension of having an easy horror game? You get a horror game that isn't very scary at all. But this just goes back into my point of the big table not being used to its full potential. I haven't talked about how the game plays yet, but that's mostly because this game controls like you would expect. There's standard tank controls to move around, you can press a button to get into aiming stance, you can press another one to fire, you can inspect the pre-rendered environment to find hidden items, and there's an inventory screen, a map screen, and weapon screen you can bring up. Let's talk about the map and weapons for a second. You can choose to look at either a smaller map of the zone you're currently in, or a larger map that shows every area in the game. There are so many areas it can seem intimidating at first, but I promise you it's not that bad. A lot of these areas you actually only go to once or twice, like the Little Shark and Sea Fox and the Navy area. The smaller map is helpful because it shows you which rooms are lacking oxygen, or may be flooded, or may even have poison gas inside. As for the weapons, you're able to hold up to 4 of them at any time. You can have 2 pistols, a harpoon gun designed for underwater use, don't waste your ammo using this on land thinking it's a shotgun like I did, learn from my mistakes, and a special weapon that can be either an SMG, or a shotgun, or assault rifle. There's also a couple of grenades at your disposal. Of course you have your normal frags, but you also have unique air grenades that do exactly what they sound like. Toss one of them and it'll refill the oxygen in a room. Speaking of weapons, the combat was fine, but I did have a couple of issues with it. They're minor gripes, but things I think are worth mentioning. In fact, one of them you can actually fix right in the game's options. There's a bunch of smaller enemies you'll have to fight, and it can be really infuriating trying to land a shot on them because they move around so fast and hop all around you. You have to be aiming at the enemy exactly if you want to hit them, and I tell you that is way harder than it sounds. But then I discovered if you toggle enemy search on in the setting, John locks on to enemies when you shoot them. It's as easy as that. I can't tell you how relieving that was to find. My only other minor gripe was there's no manual reload. The only way to reload your weapon is to use all the ammo left in your gun. And unfortunately, the game's ammo count doesn't tell you how much ammo is left in the gun. It just tells you how many bullets you have overall. I believe forcing the player to keep a mental note of how much ammo they have left instead of showing them is a good addition to the challenge, but when the player is ironically forced to waste a little ammo to have a full magazine, then there's a problem. You don't want to be caught in a situation where some monsters are chasing you down and you only have like 3 bullets loaded. It's still fun actually pulling the trigger and killing these monsters though. It's kind of satisfying how they deflate when you put them down, so you know they're dead for good. I was really impressed with this enemy design here. It might even have been the highlight of the game for me. Your main enemies are mutated humans and animals, and these monsters which are hatched from cocoons and overgrown larvae, and man, I really like these designs. And I was so glad to find out that illustrations of these monsters were published in a book called Niragram by the game's late creature designer, Yasushi Nirasawa. His goal with the monster designs was to basically show an evolution over time, which is why we start the game with grotesque monstrosities that still look a little bit human, but end with creatures that look completely alien. I actually ended up doing some more research on this guy and found out he's done work for many different series, some of which you can see on screen. I'm not gonna get into spoilers just yet, but the only thing I think the game lacked as far as enemies go was a decent villain, human or otherwise. An unstoppable beast of a monster isn't necessary for this kind of horror game, but I think it would have helped a lot if there was an unrelenting enemy that just didn't give up no matter how many times you put it down. And I only mention that because the game shows you a scene of one of the monsters you've killed coming back to life and hunting you down, which makes you think there's gonna be future confrontations with this thing. But no, they just show up again later in one more cutscene and then you never see them again. The boss fights themselves weren't terribly difficult. It's a lot of running away from them and getting pot shots in before they can close the distance. If you're lucky, you can get them stuck on walls and fire away while they stand there forced to take it. It happened to me twice and I took full advantage of it. It's cheap, yeah, but it works. There's one more thing I want to talk about before getting into the rest of the story, and that would be the puzzles. There's a grand total of 2 in the entire game, and they aren't even logic puzzles really, they're just tests of your memory. In one, you use the date located on a dog tag to open a safe, and in another, you use the date of someone's birthday to make the correct chemical ratio for a key item you need to progress. And this is not fun, by the way. I'm trying to make sample A weigh 10 grams and sample B 25, but once you press the button to make those numbers increase, they don't stop until you press them again. If you over or undershoot it by 1, you'll have to try over again. I spent like 3 minutes on this thing, which isn't that long, but it still feels like I wasted more time here than I should have. I think the devs knew just how tough this was too, cause they give you a superior healing item if you undershoot the ratio by 1. So let's just see where we are with this game. The horror's lacking, it's not very challenging, it has weak puzzles if you can even call them that. I hate to say it, but all this game really has going for it so far are some really cool enemy designs. But there is one part of the game we have yet to finish talking about. My favorite part, the story. I'm gonna be talking about the entire game start to finish, so spoiler warning. You can skip to the time on screen if you might like to experience the story on your own, but still want to hear my thoughts on the rest of the game. Earlier, I stopped talking about the story when I got to Mookie's death and the monster climbing aboard the big table, so let's go from there. After killing the monster, Clancy contacts John by radio and tells him that a SEAL team has arrived to save everyone. He also says to wrangle up some survivors if you can and return to base, also known as the CCD area, so you can all escape. But that's easier said than done. John starts by exploring the medical area of the big table, where he does meet a few survivors, but unfortunately they all turn before they can be saved. There is one other person with enough plot armor to survive this deadly infection though. It's none other than Gina. She tells John she's done some research on her own time, and it turns out to be a parasite what's making everyone go cuckoo. She also notices John's cough and decides to run tests on him to see why he hasn't turned yet, despite being in contact with the monsters more than anyone else. Her explanation is because John has a normal code virus, the parasite cells can't enter his body. Everyone without the flu is still susceptible to the parasite though. Gina decides to stay in the medical area, but John pushing onwards makes his way to the big table's apartment area where its inhabitants live. He's suddenly attacked by these gnarly creatures, but a diver named Anna saves him before it's too late. He thanks her, and she tells John she's looking for her dog, Rambo, that's gone missing, which John comes across eventually, and she thanks him for finding. John tries to get her to come with him back to the CCD area too, but she refuses as well, opting to stay in her room with her dog instead. We eventually make our way back to the CCD area and see Commander Clancy talking to Colonel McCoy. You can tell McCoy holds some animosity towards John, but Clancy tells John that what they're discussing is strictly confidential and they walk off into a conference room with other members of the SEAL team. And with nothing else to do, John returns to his own room in the CCD area where he's finally joined by Gina. She can tell John is down about something and convinces him to speak with her about what's troubling him. He tells her that he was engaged to be married to a woman named Stella who happened to be the sister of Colonel McCoy. But one day they went yachting against McCoy's better wishes and a storm suddenly struck them. It threw Stella clean into the sea, never to be found again, and filled with guilt, John resigned from the SEAL team. Before John can say anything else though, he gets a call from Dubois who tells him to come to his room because of something terrible. For some reason, Dubois has a hidden camera in the conference room, but it's a good thing he does because we find out through him that the SEAL team and Clancy are planning on fighting some of the monsters in the Big Table's air unit, which is a huge no-no because the air from their reserve tanks could escape and the Big Table could collapse. So with help from Danny, the Big Table's foreman, John makes his way to the air unit area before the SEAL team does too much damage to it. The good or bad news, depending on how you want to look at it, is they're all wiped out by a mutant rat. One of them did manage to rig an explosive to blow before dying though, and John makes a hasty escape. But the bomb ends up destroying the air unit area, which releases a huge air bubble, which shakes an aircraft carrier, which loses a fighter jet sinking into the ocean, which itself crashes into the Big Table's power supply. We have reserve power, but Clancy tells John there's still danger of the Big Table melting down and that there's no way to fix this. Our only hope now is to escape on the submersible the SEAL team came to the Big Table in, and Clancy tells us we'll have to head out and rally the survivors yet again. So first we make our way to Danny, who tells us not to trust Clancy. Just like John used to work under McCoy in a SEAL team, Danny used to work under the command of Clancy aboard a submarine. Danny claims Clancy is irrational after recalling a time where he impatiently shot a passenger ship thinking it was an enemy, and warns John that Clancy is just using him for his own survival. Danny says he still plans on escaping his own way though, and tells you where you can find Sharon. She happens to be in the Big Table Sea Farm area, which is where they tend to animals for agricultural and research purposes. Unfortunately, she dies when a mutated cow attacks her, but at least she never turned. Can't say the same for the next survivor though. Going into Anna's room, you can see one of the saddest scenes in the entire game. The lights are off so you can hardly see, but you can hear Anna begging Rambo to come and comfort her. All he ever does is bark at her though. Turning the lights on, you see Anna's mid-transformation still begging Rambo to come to her before she turns on John, who puts her out of her misery. After putting Anna down, Rambo stays in the room by her side. A short while after leaving Anna's room, you see that scene I mentioned earlier of her still being alive and hunting down John, but nothing ever comes from it. Then John makes his way to Dubois, who happens to be in the energy unit area of the Big Table doing everything he can to stop the meltdown, but it's no use. The energy unit floods, and Dubois is already showing signs of transformation. There's an optional boss fight against him if you'd like to fight him, which I chose not to do. And along his way back to the other survivors, John sees a dying McCoy who's mid-transformation. He forgives John for Stella's death and takes his own life so John doesn't have to see him as a monster. And that only leaves us with a few survivors: John, Danny, Gina, Clancy, and Anthony. Making his way back to the SEAL team submersible where we're told to rendezvous, John sees Commander Clancy betraying everyone and running away with the sub. He doesn't make it far though because a creature that was in the sub attacks and kills him. I don't know how he couldn't have noticed it, it seems pretty empty in there, but whatever. And I mean, it looks like we're shit out of luck, huh? The Big Table is still collapsing and now we have no means of escape. Plus, Danny is killed by Anna in a sacrifice to ensure John, Gina, and Anthony get to the Navy area unit, which is the one place in the Big Table that hasn't been flooded yet. There's only one way left for John and Gina to escape safely, and that happens to be the space pod that fell all the way back at the beginning of the game. So we make our way back to it and prepare for our escape, but not before learning why this pod is here in the first place and why Gina loves this chimp so much. In 1959, NASA shot Anthony into space as part of an experiment for their Mercury project, which would test how space has an effect on living things before sending actual humans. Something would go wrong with his capsule though, and Anthony remained in a state of suspended animation for 40 years while he orbited the Earth. When it finally crashed in the Pacific Ocean, Clancy was in charge of recovering it, and he tasked Gina with figuring out how Anthony survived for so long. They found out there was a bacteria in his body that mutated thanks to space radiation, which slowed down his metabolism. That same bacteria has a different effect on humans and other animals though. It's what transformed everyone into monsters, making Anthony the progenitor of the parasite. John tries to kill Anthony after learning all this because the parasite can't be allowed to reach topside, but Gina puts her life before his and she transforms into the freakiest monster yet. It's a giant blob with exposed skin and tentacles, but there's a really easy boss fight against this thing. All you have to do is keep shooting until it's dead. After you beat it though, Gina hatches from the thing as a green whatever the fuck. I mean, is it a ghost or an alien or a demon? I don't know. This is a way tougher fight. She can close the gap on you instantly, and she has so much health. Remember when I said I only managed to beat some of these bosses by getting them stuck on walls? Yeah, that applies here. We defeat it though when Gina realizes John was doing the right thing by not allowing Anthony to escape the big table. John hops in the space pod for escape, and Gina restrains Anthony as the Navy area floods, killing them both. The big table explodes, launching the capsule, and the Navy rescues John. Also, Rambo is here somehow. GG. I actually don't have a lot to say about this story, but I am glad to say I really enjoyed it. There's some substance here, but it doesn't take itself too seriously either. I really think the laughably bad voice acting and jarring CG animations add to the experience. If the game's not gonna scare you, it might as well make you laugh, right? But with that said, there are a few things I wanted to comment on. One of them I already mentioned is the wasted potential for a good antagonist. Just like I think this game misused Dana, I think they underutilized Clancy and McCoy as well. We learn from Danny that Clancy is two-faced, but he never really does anything evil besides run away with the sub at the end. For a majority of the game, he was actually a pretty solid dude, directing us on what to do for everyone's survival.
McCoy's even worse because he has a prior relationship with John, but they use him twice in the entire game.
I know the monsters are the main antagonistic force here, and I'm fine with that. I just wish the game didn't set up so many potentially good villains only to go nowhere with them. At least the final bosses are cool. I'm talking about the Gina fights. I read Nirasawa actually wasn't satisfied with Gina's final design because he had to sacrifice realism to follow through with the evolution of these monsters. I agree it's unlike anything else in the entire game, but I love it because it's so alien. I think it fits perfectly with the parasite having come from space, and that this is what a mutated human's final form looks like. I think the rest of the characters are fine for what they are. Hilarious fodder that serve to be picked off one by one like they were a group of scientists in an Antarctic research base. I've said all I wanted to about the story though, so I think we can wrap up this video now. I know I called Deep Fear a Resident Evil clone this entire video, which it is, but that's not inherently a bad thing. The good thing about Deep Fear is that it still has its own identity. It knows how to differentiate itself. The monsters are unique, and the big table and oxygen system, underwhelming as they may be, still make for an interesting stage and mechanic. And this game is freaking hilarious. Unintentionally granted, but that just makes the game more charming. Deep Fear's main problem is that it lacks both survival and horror. Everything is given to you, and you're never scared of turning a corner. I think the only real challenge in this game comes from the boss fights, cause if you slip up in those, you can take more damage than you're willing. Other than that, I don't want to say this game was a breeze, but you're not going to be struggling much either. Now, I want to be fair and clarify that I am looking at this game 25 years after it was released with the knowledge of everything its contemporaries did right, so I'm sorry if the criticism sounds harsh, but the developers knew what they were doing with Deep Fear. You know, I finished this game thinking, hey, that was a fun experience, but a pretty unfulfilling one too. I'm still glad I gave Deep Fear a chance though, and I would recommend it to anyone who loves survival horror. Actually, I'm gonna broaden that to people who like adventure games in general. If you can handle some body horror and this game looks interesting to you, then you should give it a chance. If nothing else, I'm certain you'll get a nice laugh. Hey everyone, it's Cosmo. I hope you enjoyed this spooky video. I decided to make it the last minute for Halloween. I don't have anything else to say. Like, comment, share, whatever. Cue with me to is next, I promise. Thank you for watching. Bye. Happy Halloween.